Would you be surprised if I told you that Hollywood is trying to influence the way we think just by changing the narrative on specific aspects of life or popular culture? I guess you may not, but they are. And it's really interesting because my guest on today's episode is Anna Jane Joyner. She is the founder of Good Energy, and she's here to talk about her work working with Hollywood screenwriters so that they have more stories, whether they be fictional, non-fictional, regarding climate change. We're going to talk about climate storytelling in Hollywood on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And today's episode is one of those episodes where, I get these emails from people all the time. And sorry about my voice. I'm still getting over the weekend of tournaments and hockey. It's probably not going to get any better anytime soon. But I get these emails from people all the time being like, oh, this person, I've got a great guest for you. This person would be great. They want to come on your podcast, talk about their work. Well, I got an email from a media company that was trying to get Anna Jane Joyner on the show to talk about a number of different things, but really climate change storytelling and why it's important to have it in Hollywood. We always talk about Hollywood in a bad way. Hollywood's bad for this, Hollywood's bad for that. There's Me Too. It's obviously some things that are very legitimate that could be bad, but also we never really talk about the influence that Hollywood has on us in terms of the storytelling, how those stories are portrayed, what's in those stories. We talk about a lot of times media and advertising, so product placement, like if there's a Coke or a Pepsi or a MacBook Pro or some kind of Apple device, and you start to get influenced by those because it's just based on product placement. But what about story placement and story mentions? Imagine watching a show. One of the shows that I really enjoy watching is The Rookie, right? It's a cop show. You got engaging characters. You've got some, sometimes it's a drama. Sometimes has a little bit of comedic attitude towards it. But it can be very serious at times. But the stories that go within each episode, there's opportunities there to talk about a variety of different issues that are going on in the world without really addressing them as the main point of the story, as the main plot. A lot of times there's subplots. Well, you can do that with climate change. You can do that with ocean conservation. And that's what I loved about my interview today with Anna Jane Joyner, who comes on the podcast and says, hey, she started to work with people, screenwriters, who approach them to say, hey, we want to insert these stories within Hollywood productions, within TV shows. And I just think that it's such a great way of getting people to normalize specific topics, especially climate change, right? The more they see, whether they're extreme, whether they're subtle, whether they have a comedic sort of spin to them or a dramatic sort of spin to them, having that thought process, having it in front of you and picturing it and visualizing it can really help us normalize this discussion about climate change. And when you normalize the discussion, as Anna Jane says in the interview, you start to take climate action. That's the next step. And that's what I loved about this interview. So without further ado, here's the interview with Anna Jane Joyner talking about storytelling for climate. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Anna Jane, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about climate storytelling?
It's my favorite subject.
Love it. Love it. It is a subject matter that has definitely come to the forefront of just sort of environmental awareness and ocean awareness as it is on this podcast. Climate change is rearing its ugly head even more and more every year, especially since, since last summer, since we saw in 2023, just overall, and it continues seemingly in 2024. So, I've had a lot of people reach out. They say, I have this like climate anxiety. I'm getting frustrated with politicians. I'm getting frustrated with people around me. And so can you do an episode where you have someone come on who's an expert on, mental health and climate change and like who's told stories that are more optimistic, kind of getting people in the know of what's going on. And so I'm so happy that Anna Jane, you are here today. And I can't wait to be able to talk about all things sort of climate storytelling, because I think it's something that's extremely important. It doesn't get enough credit, and it doesn't get enough exposure to sort of the mainstream population. So I'm super excited you're here. But before we get into all of that, Anna Jane, why don't you just let me know, let the audience know who you are and what you do.
Yes, my name is Anna Jane Joyner. I am the founder and CEO of Good Energy, which is a nonprofit creative support organization that works with TV and film writers on portraying the climate crisis on screen and also on podcasts. We work on scripted podcasts as well.
I love it. I love it. It's such an interesting career to get into. It's not what I would consider your typical conservation career. Maybe a community, even for communications, it seems like a little unique in a very great way. How did all this, like, where did this all begin? Like, how did you even think about this? Take us back to sort of like education and just sort of childhood of like, was environmentalism always in your blood or in your head?
No, it definitely wasn't. Although I'm sitting here on the Gulf Coast of Alabama on a property on the water that has been my family for 5 generations. And I grew up here in the summer times, and then the rest of the year in the Blue Ridge Mountains near Asheville, North Carolina.
Nice.
So even though environmentalism was not a popular term in my family, we did grow up in truly gorgeous places, and that was important to my parents to raise us in the natural world. However, my dad is an evangelical megachurch pastor, so I grew up in a very conservative, very religious household where environmentalists were not someone you aspired to be. They were the other side. And I, in some ways, I think, people often ask, how do you go from growing up as a preacher's kid to working with Hollywood writers on climate storytelling? And I do think that like anyone who's raised in a kind of a more intense religious setting sort of innately understands the power of story, because religion is just a set of stories that deeply impacts us on both individual and collective ways, and hugely transforms the world for good and for bad. So I do think I've always been drawn to stories. My dad's also a writer. He's working on his 100th book. All of my brothers and sisters are artists. One of my brothers is a filmmaker. My mom's a musician. So I just grew up in a family where art and storytelling were really, really prioritized. And then when I got into climate, which I started getting into in college, I originally got into it studying abroad in New Zealand. And I left the church when I was around 15 and was kind of just a heathen. I was at a sorority, and I just running around in New Zealand. I happened to take an ecology course there, mostly because I went to UNC Chapel Hill, and our science curriculum there is very rigorous. So I thought if I took it abroad, it would be easier. Almost failed it, but came back, ironic story. But through that, learning about how ecosystems work and how grasses grow and bird migration and running around in New Zealand, one of the most beautiful places in the world, it really was this kind of falling in love experience with the earth. And the first time since, I had left the church where I really had a sense of calling and purpose and meaning, and sort of knew like, this is what I want to do. I want to help protect this place that I really, really love. And so, and then I basically, when I got back to UNC, I switched my major. Back then they drove everyone who cared about climate to science. And I kind of quickly realized that science was not my superpower, but I was studying under Dr. Robbie Cox, who wrote the first textbook on environmental communication. And that came out, the first edition came out while I was taking his class, and was like, science might not be my thing, but communications feels, I am good at this. I like it. And it feels like a really big gap, especially that was almost 20 years ago. So there's very little happening when it comes to climate communications back then. But I was hooked, and the rest is history.
Well, and it's so interesting too, because, I think we come from a same sort of generation in terms of, going to school and stuff. And even back, 20 years ago, it was almost like a faux pas to talk about climate change in general setting, like a mainstream setting, right? We talked about it in the science community. I did my undergraduate and graduate degree. We talked a lot about, climate change, the predictions that are happening now, and have happened over the past 20 years were being predicted, just not as quickly maybe, but we knew what was going to happen. But if I spoke to anybody about it, people were like, that's ridiculous. Kyoto Protocol was being talked about back then. And, I know from me who lives in Canada, we were like, our government was like, no, we're not going to be following, or we are going to be following, then we're not going to be following, depending who was in charge in that time. And it was an extremely frustrating time from a communication standpoint because it just wasn't talked about enough. People were not as aware, and we were falling for the miscommunication and misinformation that was being brought out by the fossil fuel, which is now has been admitted by the fossil fuel industry and the coal industry. And it was just a tough time to get into communication. So back then, how did you navigate the career? Because you can't talk about what you talk about now especially when we talk about different voices, which we'll get into now, that wasn't talked about back then. Even climate change itself wasn't really talked about back then. What was that navigating that career in communications at that time?
Yeah, I think I kind of was holding two things at the same time. One is, when I first started, the first 5 years, maybe even longer, maybe closer to 7 or 8 years of my career working on climate campaigns, we couldn't say the word climate change, like that wasn't even allowed in the climate movement at that point. Right. And I, at first I sort of got that logic, but the more I got into it, the bigger crisis it, became. And as we learned about what was coming down the pike, I felt strongly that we should be naming it and talking about it. So I guess I was maybe an early adopter for communicating directly about climate.
Right.
But then also, I did a lot of organizing faith communities, including evangelicals, right. where climate, even till this day, can be polarizing, less so with younger evangelicals. Also, Latino and Black evangelicals tend to be a lot better on climate. I think it's a mistake that people often paint all American evangelicals as one entity, but there's
right.
There's important different audiences that approach climate or are open to climate in different ways. Globally, evangelicals are much stronger on climate than they are in the United States, but even within the US, young evangelicals and Latino and Black evangelicals tend to be much stronger on climate. All that to say, I do think that there are situations where talking about a climate related issue or solution or even impact or problem without saying climate makes sense. Just to give you an example, the big campaign that I worked on before I really went more in the direction of TV and film was the Beyond Coal campaign. And I really started that through the End Mountaintop Removal campaign movement, which was, mountaintop removal. Coal mining is where they blow the tops off of Appalachian mountains to get into coal. It destroys the mountains. It destroys the nearby communities. There's all kinds of horrible public health impacts from the air and water pollution. And, my dad, we grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. Like, we grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which don't have coal, thankfully, but they were our neighbors. And so that was an issue, even though it was climate related, but my dad still felt very strongly about. And same with actually coal overall. He is not a fan of coal because of the public health impacts. And same with plastics. He really hates single-use plastics in particular, not because of the climate, connection, but because we live on the water and we see the pollution directly, and because the health impacts, particularly on the reproductive system. So there are definitely strategies where you don't need to name climate for specific audiences. But also, I think at this point, it's just so important to talk about climate. And I can tell you more reasons why I feel that way. But so holding those two things. And really, all of my work is, including Good Energy, is underpinned by really good audience analysis. So when I was studying communications at UNC, my major was actually rhetoric with a minor in environmental studies. And the first thing we were taught, in rhetoric classes was the number one rule to persuasion is to know your audience. And it was shocking to me being in climate campaign strategy sessions where people would put, audiences up on the board
Yeah.
where it was like faith communities. I was like, that's literally like saying Americans. Like
Yeah. There's so
even
many different
yeah,
types.
like
Right.
even the diversity within the evangelical community like is pretty vast, and you really need to know, are you talking to an evangelical like my dad, which is more kind of charismatic Pentecostal, or more of
Mm-hmm.
like a Bible Belt evangelical Southern Baptist, because that is different stories and different communication strategies. And so I think that's been a big hurdle for the climate movement, is just prioritizing really intimately getting to know what audiences that you're talking to, and what resonates with them.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you approach it that way, when you start to think about it that way, because we often dismiss different communities because they won't listen to the words climate change. But if you present it as, like you mentioned, a public health problem with coal, looking at air quality, water quality, or plastics, you're looking at, microplastics now are in everything, including air. You can approach it from a different aspect, and a lot of people just may not realize that they're unified over the same thing, just maybe not the same terminology. And so words definitely matter in communication. And sometimes you can include a group. It's just a matter of how you approach that group. And it's I learned a long time ago, starting in science communication with this podcast, that dismissing some like a community, whether it be a right or left politics, or like you said, faith-based communities, and treating them all at one, like the same. And it's just not the way to do it. It's to hit what their values are, and to say, okay, this is how it affects your values. And then let's move on from there. I think that's a great way to think about it, and a great way to teach, upcoming science communicators about that as well. I think that's amazing.
And I also think, and this is like a little bit of a soapbox, but I think that there's a humility factor that's really important.
Right.
When we're trying to reach and persuade and collaborate with specific audiences, if you come in with without having done your research, without knowing who you're talking to and what stories and issues and things resonate with them, then that's just coming in from a vantage point of arrogance, like you, and transaction, like you audience are here to give me something versus how do I support you and figure out how, to help you really wrestle with these issues.
Yeah. You have to build that relationship, right? You had that relationship with your fellow evangelicals, and you were able to look at who's different within the community and how to approach each one, because you know them. You were in that church for quite a long time, and you're able to approach them. The jargon, and how to approach it, and how to mention it. And I think that's really important. And I think that's why it's so important to have different voices within sort of climate, as well as ocean conservation and awareness campaigns and so forth. So Good Energy is your company, right? You founded this company. Was this right off the bat? Good Energy kind of came out right out of university, or is this something that's been sort of a while in the making as you evolved as a science communicator?
Yeah, we are a nonprofit, but although funny, going back to knowing your audience, oftentimes when we're talking to industry folks, especially creative executives, we don't mention that we're a nonprofit because they trust you more if you're for profit, and they know you more.
Yeah.
So it goes back to knowing your audience. But Good Energy, I think in a lot of ways, my entire life and career has been building up to Good Energy. But the actual way that it began and kind of came to life in its current iteration is I just felt from a climate communications, because of my family and the emphasis on art and entertainment and storytelling, I was always looking for more creative and emotive and evocative ways that climate was showing up in popular culture, whether or not that was music or TV and film. And I just, knew that there was not very much happening. And this was back in 2018. I also knew that there were other organizations doing work within Hollywood. I almost think of them as like lobbyists. They're just not lobbying government officials. They're lobbying creative executives and writers
Interesting.
to incorporate their issues into television and film. And
Huh.
that is, so there's this whole kind of ecosystem within Hollywood of narrative change organizations who work on different issue areas. And I adapted that model that already exists. Great orgs like Define American does this work for
Right.
immigration. GLAAD does it around marriage equality and LGBTQ representation. Planned
Yes.
Parenthood has a great Hollywood program. So there, those models existed, but there
Yeah.
was nothing for climate change.
Right.
And the way that I kind of got into it specifically is in 2018, I had a writer from Madam Secretary, a CBS kind of political drama,
Yeah.
write me. And he was like, I want to write a story about a young woman challenging her powerful evangelical father on climate change. And when he was doing the research for that story, somehow came across a former intern who was running Young Evangelicals for Climate Action.
Right.
And he was like, that's like a real person, right? So then Alex Maggio, who's the screenwriter that I worked with, reached out, and I was like, of course, yeah, I'd love to help you with this. And because my brother had gone to film school and I'd read a lot of scripts and given notes on a lot of scripts, I was just familiar enough with the process of screenwriting to be a really great partner. And we worked on developing that character together, to developing the whole storyline. They even cast the character to look loosely like me. And then there was a whole other climate storyline that wove into the episode around climate migration that I also helped them do research for. And through that, it was like, Alex, why aren't we seeing more of this? And can you connect me to all your friends who are screenwriters so I can just get on the phone and talk to anyone who will talk to me? And he, of course, is also feeling a great deal of climate anxiety, has little kids, and is like, yes, I want to help in whatever way I can. So he connected me to a bunch of folks, very high level showrunners down to mid-level writers. And I just got on the phone with anyone who would talk to me to get a sense of what are the hurdles, what are the ways we can better support writers. And that very, personal campaign turned into good energy. So I consulted on Madam Secretary at the end of 2018. Started calling whatever screenwriter would talk to me the first couple months of 2019. And then by that summer, Sierra Club and Bloomberg Philanthropies came on as our first partners and funders. And we started piloting Good Energy in July 2019. And the rest is history.
That is insane. There was so much information you just dropped in there. I kind of want to go through it bit by bit. So what you're saying is that there's almost like these groups of people, you can almost say they're lobbyists who from whatever background they come from, they want to sort of, I guess, influence people by showing the storylines or working with different production companies and networks and so forth to show storylines that's important to them. And because it influences us as viewers, because we see this, and the more we see it, the more we accept it. So just like, for instance, marriage equality and LGBTQ representation, we're starting to see more and more of that. I almost feel like it's commonplace now in Hollywood where you get a show where there's somebody representing, the LGBTQ community. And so it's just more common practice as more and more people watch those shows. It's kind of normalized, right? Mm-hmm. So having that for you was you wanted to normalize sort of just climate action and just, climate, I guess, issues and events and how people are getting over it, and just kind of talking about it during shows such as Madam Secretary, which is a political show, a political fictional show, drama, great show, by the way. And to be able to be a part of that must have been absolutely amazing. Did you ever think that was a pathway before you got connected with this person?
I loosely knew that there were other organizations working on other issue areas like Color of Change and GLAAD and Planned Parenthood and Define American that worked within Hollywood to integrate their issue areas onto screen and support screenwriters. And I knew that there wasn't anything like that for climate. And so I had the beginnings of the thought prior to working on Madam Secretary. But then when I worked on that show and, started really talking to writers and other people in the industry was when the strategy really came together. But it's, you're totally right. Almost every other social movement has worked with Hollywood to integrate their issues into television and film. And it goes back, from the very beginning of the industry. I mean, the US military has put hundreds of millions of dollars into Hollywood engagement on the FBI has people in Hollywood, the CIA has people in Hollywood, the LAPD has people in Hollywood where they take people on rides or out on like, I guess, parole, whatever you call that when you go out in cop cars.
Like a patrol.
And so, and also the oil industry has had people in Hollywood from the very beginning, and that, I mean, they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and that and like, for example, in I think it was the 1930s, Standard Oil partnered with Disney and had Mickey Mouse go on a road trip around different Standard Oil stations. And they also funded a Oscar-nominated film in 1948 called Louisiana Story, which is about a little boy and his pet raccoon, and it glorifies the oil industry, and have just systemically invested in using Hollywood to create the narrative that we all now live under, which is that, prosperity, modernity, all of these things require oil.
Right.
And then, of course, like on the U.S. military front, you have like during World War II, they pumped out over 300 movies in just a couple of years. And President Roosevelt called it a critical part of the war effort. And so the U.S. military has understood the power of Hollywood for over a century. And then, there are great examples of other kind of social issue areas, everything from drunk driving, like the effort to popularize the term designated driver was very intentionally done through television and film. And within 3 years of that campaign going live, drunk driving related deaths went down like 30%. It was a really clear correlation.
So when we talk about behavior change and influence, we really talk about using the issues and bringing them up and bringing those solutions to television and movies, because we're so enthralled with television and movies, and there's so many more places now where they get created that you're just like, this is how we influence people. They don't even realize they're being influenced. This is how we influence people. I never thought about it that way. You kind of think about it in the back of your mind, but you never really like sit down and be like, oh my gosh, this is a huge thing. So how did you get coined Hollywood's climate advisor?
It's a great, sorry, wait, my partner just walked in. There might be a little bit of noise in the background for a second.
No worries.
Do you mind taking them into the other room? My dogs are excited.
I was about to say, yes, the dogs. Dogs are welcome on this podcast. No worries. I want to come back to like a Madam Secretary impact study we did. Should I tell you about that now, just to wrap that part? Yeah. Just say before I answer that. Okay. Go ahead.
Cool.
Go ahead.
Before I jump into that, I wanted to tell you a really cool kind of full circle story. One of our partners has done an impact study on that Madam Secretary episode, so the first script that I consulted on, and the research hasn't come out yet, but they did definitively see that viewers were more likely to take action on climate change on non-viewers, and kind of a neutral pool. So we will have, which just shows like these stories have very real world impact. People do, and not only changes perceptions, it changes people's actions.
Right. That's unreal. And it's so cool that there's a study on it to look at that behavior change, right? That's awesome.
Oh yeah, USC's Media Impact Project, who we do our academic research with, their specialty is studying the impact of entertainment, largely TV and film, and they've looked across all kinds of different issue areas to look at the real world impact of these kinds of stories.
It's so interesting because, you really think with product placement, as a viewer, you start to notice in movies and TV that and how it influences you, and whether you're going to pick up a Pepsi or a Coke or, I got to go check my computer because I see a MacBook or whatever. I never even thought about the subject matters and why those subject matters are written about. Usually I just figured it had to do with popular culture. Obviously climate change is now part of popular culture. But I just never thought that that would be such a huge business or huge aspect, of screenwriting and Hollywood. And it's just amazing. So you consulted on the script for Madam Secretary, obviously a hit. How did that get into again, going back to the Hollywood climate advisor? How did that sort of were you called that after that script, or did you have more, or did that develop into more?
Oh, one more just cool, interesting tidbit about the Madam Secretary episode is that, to give you an example of scale, which is the reason that Hollywood is so critical, one is because of their storytelling power and the power of TV and film to inspire people and change people. But also the scale, that Madam Secretary episode aired to 8 million people within the first week. And that, the climate movement hadn't had a substantive form of communication about climate change, certainly not in an emotive, way in the previous, 3 to 6 months at that level that reached that many people in one amount of time. So the scale of the numbers that we're talking about are really, really huge, which is obviously very important because we have to mobilize climate action at scale. 100%. But the New York Times did call me Hollywood's climate advisor. That was several years later. So we started piloting Good Energy in 2019. I started working on other scripts. We did an event just to see who would show up. It was packed, there was celebrities there. It was very just clear that there was an enthusiasm and an appetite for this within the industry.
Yeah.
And then we almost didn't make it through 2020 because of a variety of factors. Hollywood shut down. My life was a mess. Mike Bloomberg ran for office and he's one of our core funders, all kinds of reasons, but we did survive. And in 2022, we released a playbook for screenwriting in the age of climate change, where we talked to over 100 TV and film writers, in addition to those early conversations where I just would get on the phone with anyone. But our qualitative research, or our strategy director who oversees all of our qualitative research, comes out of IDEO. So deep listening and intimately getting to know our audience is a really critical part of all of our work. Yeah. And all of those conversations directly informed the playbook. And so when the playbook came out, it was within a year or so after the playbook came out that, Good Energy kind of rose to the prominence within the industry, where people started saying things like that.
So cool. I mean, you must have been pretty flattered and proud hearing that, especially in the New York Times, where you get such a compliment. And obviously something's never really happened like that before. You were the first. Your organization was the first, and so to have Good Energy to be a part of that, to have your name attached to that, must have been just absolutely amazing. What was your plan after that? I mean, obviously, your name gets big. Did that article turn into sort of more inquiries into what you do?
Yeah. So we and definitely flag me if you don't think I'm answering this specifically, because there's a couple of directions my head is going. So we released the playbook for screenwriting in the age of climate change at the Academy Museum, Earth Week of 2022.
Nice.
And had a sold out crowd in the middle of the pandemic. Again, every single in-person event that we've done has been sold out. So it's just consistent feedback that there's a huge appetite within the industry. And also that we throw great events because we know our audience and we know what they like to show up to.
Right.
And so after the playbook was released is really when we started developing some of our other program areas. So I'd been consulting on TV and film scripts for years at that point, but we hadn't kind of officially announced the consulting program. So we spent about 6 months doing research on peer organizations like Define American and GLAAD and other groups who do this kind of story consulting for other issue areas. and adapted all those best practices into building our consulting program. And we also did another round of qualitative research with creative executives and writers, and all of those insights went into building the consulting program and our workshops program. We have a really popular workshops program as well. Yeah.
Who attends those workshops? Like, who do you work with those workshops?
Well, primarily screenwriters.
Screenwriters, okay.
Yes, but we do have a version for creative executives as well. And sometimes we'll do them for climate communication specialists or a journalist, because, there's some, it's was very important to me to build good energy specifically for screenwriters and creative executives, because I knew that that's what was going to be most effective for getting more climate on screen. But obviously there is storytelling overlap in any form of communication. So we have found that journalists and climate communication practitioners also have really enjoyed our workshops.
I can imagine. Yeah. That sounds it sounds very interesting. It sounds very educational too, to be able to do this. And I guess like the people who are coming to this, the screenwriters, the journalists, especially the screenwriters, it's like you mentioned, is it what you mentioned before, where their conscious is starting to think more about climate change. So screenwriters write, I guess a lot of it's from personal experience, what they're thinking about, what they think other people are thinking about. Is that why they're coming to you to get more information, to just like, hey, look, there's a lot of, especially after this summer. I mean, I can't even imagine. You must be like super busy after this summer, because climate change has been at the forefront of bad news around the world. But they must be coming to you just being like, hey, there's a lot of stuff we can do with this to get more awareness out. Is that how they're approaching you?
Yeah. So we have a couple of different ways of engaging with writers and creative executives versus more kind of climate movement type of audiences. But I think there's a couple of components here that really lent to Good Energy's growth and just the growth of interest within the industry in general. One is we started piloting in July 2019, which it was when the fires out there were really, really bad. And Greta Thunberg had kind of taken off and captured global imagination. And so there was I do think
strikes, the Friday
the global strikes.
Yeah.
So I think it was more in kind of our collective consciousness, including within the industry. So there was more openness to it than probably previous years. I wish we had started 10 years earlier, because we would have built all the relationships and we would have been primed, but we're doing what we can. But so a lot of the writers that we spoke to for the qualitative research around the playbook, which we did in 2021, we're experiencing really severe and profound climate anxiety. I've had showrunners tell me they've had to evacuate their children multiple times because of screenwriters. I know screenwriters who've already moved away from California because their fire insurance was getting so high. And these are well-established screenwriters. Like, these are not kind of blue collar folks. And I think, LA is very much on the front lines of climate change, and people were feeling that more and more. They were feeling anxiety about it. Where they hadn't kind of made the leap was, how does that influence their creativity and their storytelling and their job? And so that was definitely a big part of Good Energy's work. And when we did that qualitative research around the playbook, we found really interesting insights. For example, most writers were equating climate stories with apocalypse stories. So in the rare occasion that you do see it show up in television film, it's oftentimes apocalypse stories. A lot of writers felt shame and guilt over their own personal carbon footprint. So oftentimes in the rare occasion it shows up in TV and film, it's someone shaming someone about their SUV or their plastic straw. And I think that's a direct result from the writer's lived experience and emotional experience. And it was a hurdle for them. They felt like they had to have a perfect carbon footprint before they could authentically write about it. So a big part of what we do is just kind of emphasizing Bill McKibben's the price of admission to the climate movement is hypocrisy, and none of us are perfect, and that can't keep us from doing what we can and using our skill set. And then I think another really interesting hurdle that we encountered was, we called it going to the Google hellscape. So a lot of writers who were interested in writing about climate were going to do research and just feeling really overwhelmed with, the 500 organizations doing this work. You can't tell who's credible and who isn't.
Yeah.
Even when you go to the NASA website, a lot of the language that's used is still very dense and scientific, and it's hard for the layperson to understand. So a lot of our work, certainly the playbook, but all of our work is translating climate information into not only information for creatives, also inspiration. So how do we provide both the information that they need, but also the inspiration for how it could be showing up in their stories. And so that was a big purpose of the playbook. Like, let's try to bypass this Google hellscape and give them everything they need on a silver platter, which is a lot of what we do in our consulting work too. Like, we'll do all the research for you. We'll figure out the experts you need to talk to, whatever it is that you need to make this story include climate and make it good, we will figure out how to support you with.
So essentially they come up, it's like, tell me everything you know about wildfires. And then, so you do all the research, here you go. Here's like from all the different avenues, here's the science behind it. And here's the translation of that, their interpretation of that. And then you just kind of give it to them. It's like, you make the story and you let them make the story. And then they'll come back to you and then be like, well, what about this? And what about this question? And then you continue to consult and answer their questions. Is that sort of the gist of it?
Yeah, we do. So we do a lot of what we do is climate research, which is research briefs, exactly like that. Like I did an interesting one on arsenic, dust, and climate recently, which I didn't even know there was a connection, but there is. And I figured out the 4 best experts. But in addition to translating that information and expertise, we also pull a lot of inspiration. So if it's, just like weird stories, like true stories, really inspiring, kind of unusual characters that, have some connection to whatever climate topic that they're working on, writing about. So we look, we definitely translate the hard information, but I would say equally importantly, we pull a bunch of creative inspiration, because that's really what, influences most writers, is like the imaginative part of it. And then we also do, we do a lot of world building research. So that's, if this story is taking place in Michigan in 20 years, what in a 3 Celsius scenario, what is that? What are the climate impacts on that region, and how, and so helping people think through the world building part of it, especially, for future stories. And then we do a lot of script consulting and story consulting too, where we're not just providing the expertise or the inspiration, we're working with them hands-on about how it's showing up in the story.
Right. Is there one for South Florida where it's like completely flooded in like 30, 40 years?
There's a great episode of Extrapolations on Apple TV, which is the show we worked on. We did a lot of the world building research on it.
Okay.
Episode 3 is about Miami. It's a rabbi. It's a great faith meets mental health meets climate story.
Interesting.
Okay. One of my favorites.
Look at that. I didn't even expect that. I was expecting to be like, no, not yet. But okay. I like that. We'll have to link to that in the show notes. It's really, I think, again, it just fascinates me how we can have such a role in making and normalizing the different aspects of climate change, and not just sort of the extreme acts. Because like you mentioned, a lot of the early, and when I mean early, I mean like the last 10 years, movies on climate change were like apocalyptic kind of climate change. 2012 and all that one, like those wonderful, the shows that would, terrify people, almost to a point where it's like, this isn't ever going to happen in my lifetime or my children's lifetime. People would just be like, I'm going to dismiss it. Do you ever worry about, or have you ever come across sort of just this, what I call climate exhaustion, climate change exhaustion, where they're just like, I hear so much about it, I'm just done with it. Are you worried that that's going to happen within like the TV industry or the movie industry, where people are just, they hear all about the bad things? And so they're just like, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Do you ever worry about that, or have you ever come across that?
Couple of thoughts. Definitely one of the things that we found in our research was that people were worried about depressing themselves and audiences. And, you do get pushed back a fair amount. That's like, we have to be only telling funny, entertaining, escapist stories. And we have 2 responses to that. One, you can absolutely incorporate climate into escapism.
Yeah.
Like for example, Abbott Elementary, which is a very popular comedy sitcom right now on ABC. Quinta Brunson, who's the creator and star, really cares about climate change. It was very important to her to weave climate change throughout the different stories. It shows up in multiple episodes across all 3 seasons, and it's done in a very funny way.
Right.
It's like very humorous, and there's quite a few good examples now of how it can show up in stories that isn't just depressing. That being said, we have plenty of examples of great television and film that are about really hard subjects. I mean, Schindler's List, Handmaid's Tale, Squid Game, like these are dark stories that are very commercially successful, very creatively inspiring. And so we kind of encourage people to not be scared by the idea of wrestling with a harder, darker subject matter, but also that you don't have to only talk about climate in harder, darker stories.
Yeah, no doubt. And I agree with you in terms of like, I guess the stories have to be told within the context of the shows or the TV, or like if it's a drama, then maybe you can get a little bit more serious. If it's a comedy, play it up a little bit with some jokes here and there and see how it goes. And nobody wants to be depressed all the time. They come to certain shows for watching a certain genre of TV, and that's or movies or both, and that's what they get. I can understand that. Now you've been involved in your own production. Am I right with now Climate Reality Check? This is something, is this new to you? And can you just tell people about, just introduce it a little bit, and then we can talk about sort of how it came about?
Sure. Yeah. It's not, I wouldn't call it a production. It's a tool.
Okay.
So there's this very cool tool that's used ubiquitously in the industry called the Bechdel test.
Okay.
And it was created by Alison Bechdel. Actually, it was in a comic strip. It was The Year I Was Born, 1985. So 40 years next year. And it's to measure female representation on screen. And it's a really simple, kind of lighthearted, incisive test. It's basically like, are there characters who are female who are named? Do they talk to each other? Do they talk to each other about something other than men? And you would be shocked how many movies and shows don't meet that criteria. But it's become this very practical tool that not only writers and executives use to see if female representation is being adequately captured in their stories, but also audiences can use. And researchers for that matter. And so we wanted something very, something similar where it was a baseline test. So we're not telling you what kind of story to write. We are just assessing whether or not climate change exists in the world of your story. Right. And the questions are very simple. They are, does climate change exist in the world of your story? And does a character know about it? And we give all these different kind of creative ways for how you could apply that. We applied it to this year's Oscar nominees. So we have that coming out, and I can tell you a couple of the ones that did acknowledge climate change. Absolutely. And it's incisive, it's fun, it's lighthearted, it's easy to use, but it's also just very practical, and it kind of gives the executive or the writer or the showrunner a very clear tool to say, does this exist in my story world? How are my characters responding to it? And if it doesn't, or if they're not, how should they be? In a way that feels very authentic and true to the story and the characters themselves. And that's like a big point that we make that has been very effective is, we actually don't even use the term climate storytelling anymore, because we found in our qualitative research that people were associating that with like some sort of whole new kind of story or like new kind of genre where climate is really the central focus. And of course, we do want more television and film where climate is the central focus, but we also just want climate showing up in any contemporary story that's set on Earth. And that's, and that's kind of one of our big North Star goals, is that by 2028, 50% of contemporary television and film stories that are set on Earth now or in the future acknowledge climate change in some way, shape, or form as a part of the world of the story. in the same way that it is increasingly a part of our everyday lives and in our actual world. And that's kind of the creative lens that we come from. We call it the climate lens. It's if your story was taking place in the real world, if these were real characters, how would they authentically be encountering climate change in their lives? And once you start exploring that, you unpack all of these creative ways that it could be showing up across your story.
Yeah, and it gives people sort of that measurement of like, am I doing this properly? Like, is this really effective? Is this if you're gonna put it in, you might as well make it effective and make it well. I love this. And how long? So this is new. This is a new tool that you've
it comes out on Friday, March 1st.
Very nice.
Yes.
Very nice. That's awesome. And so you mentioned you applied it to some of the movies in the Oscars. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we did a study with USC's Media Impact Project in 2022, where we basically wanted to test this hypothesis that climate change was not showing up in scripted TV and film very much. And we looked at over 37,000 scripts that aired between 2016 and 2020. Not we, USC's
but still,
PhD students.
Wow. Yeah.
But a huge swath of what actually aired during that time period. And climate change only showed up 2.8% of the time. And that includes pretty much anything related to it, because we studied all these keywords like sea level rise or solar panels. So obviously, and that's just mentions, the actual stories are far, far lower. So our goal is that by 2028, 50% of contemporary television and film stories acknowledge climate change. And this tool, the climate reality check, is a way of measuring that anyone can use to measure any story. And so we took it and we worked with a awesome group at Colby College, the Buck Lab for the Environment, to apply the climate reality check to this year's Oscar nominees. And the qualifications were it had to be set on Earth, so no high fantasy. Right. And it had to take place now or in the future, so no historicals. And 13% of the films that were nominated in the scripted categories qualified. Okay. 3 of those, which is 23%, passed.
Okay.
And that, and obviously the USC research was a quantitative study. This is, we really just did the Oscar nominees because it's a good way of looking at the films that were the most popular over the past year. And the 3 that passed were Barbie, Mission Impossible, and Nyad, which was pretty exciting to me because obviously, all of those are amazing films, but Barbie and Mission Impossible were 2 of the biggest films last year.
Yeah. Yeah. And you wouldn't think with Mission Impossible, just like it's such an adventure. With Barbie, I can understand because they were trying to do a lot in the film, and I feel like I haven't seen it yet, but I feel like they accomplished a lot in that film. So I can see.
You have to see it; it's phenomenal.
I know it's queued up. It's queued up. So I can see it doing really well. Mission Impossible, like in terms of covering climate change, Mission Impossible is interesting because a lot of explosions, a lot of adventure kind of things going on. You wouldn't think that would be addressing climate change or having climate change within the story or buried within the story. I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure. What was the last movie you mentioned? I don't know if I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, and I can tell you how it showed up too if you're interested.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
So, and 2 of them are what we have kind of a spectrum of how climate shows up in TV and film. And the first one is what we call climate placement. So that is when a solution or an impact is in the background, like the setting, but it's not directly addressed in dialogue. So like an EV, is the car that they drive, but they don't talk about the connection to climate. Right. It shows, a great example is Parasite, which was an Oscar-winning Best Picture film from a few years ago. Yes. And it has a story, a core part of the story is this huge flood that happened that destroyed the home of the poorer family and inconvenienced the camping trip or the wealthier family. If you know anything about climate impacts on South Korea, you would recognize that this is very in line with their actual impacts. However, they never talk about it directly, so a lot of the audience would have missed the climate connection.
Gotcha.
So that would be climate placement. Okay. Climate mention is just when it comes up in passing, but it's not, it doesn't really influence the story. And then we have climate world, which is where it's a part of the world of the story. It comes up in several places over time. It affects kind of minor plot lines, but it's not the central focus of the story. And then you would have what we would call climate characters, which are the episode of Madam Secretary that I worked on, Day After Tomorrow, extrapolations, stories where climate really is the central driver of the characters in the plot. So two of the Oscar ones are climate mentions, Barbie and Mission Impossible. And the climate placement, I should say too, sorry, this is a lot of jargon. Feel free to cut any of this. Climate placement wouldn't pass our test in most cases. Like you have to make the connection to an impact or a solution for it to pass the test.
Gotcha.
And not that there's not all kinds of psychological benefits for showing solutions in the background of stories, like any kind of product placement for cueing, encouraging positive behaviors, etc. Netflix just announced a deal with GM last year where they're doing all EVs in their in-house production. So there's all kinds of great work happening on the climate placement front, but we tend to focus on the actual acknowledgement in the story itself.
Gotcha.
So Barbie, it comes up when the little girl, Sasha, Barbie walks up to her. She's a middle school student, and Barbie kind of thinks that this little girl is going to be so excited to see her and view her as a hero. And she just goes off on her and is like, you set the feminist movement back 50 years. You destroyed girls' innate sense of worth. You're killing the planet with your glorification of rampant consumerism. And it totally worked for the story and the character. And in a lot of ways, that was Sasha's really defining character moment. Right. And it just, it was very in line with how Gen Z is viewing a lot of this. It talked about the intersection with feminism. It really worked for the character. And it was an overt mention of climate, even though they didn't say the terms. But, it was a passing conversation. The rest of the story unfolded. Mission Impossible was similar. It was a character talking to Ethan Hunt, who is Tom Cruise's character. And he said, the next world war isn't going to be a cold one. It's going to be a ballistic war over a rapidly shrinking ecosystem. It's going to be a war for the last of our dwindling energy, drinkable water, and breathable air.
That pretty much sums it up.
Very direct, acknowledgement of climate change. And also, one of the reasons I'm super excited to see it in Mission Impossible is because that reached, more moderate to conservative viewers. My dad loved that movie. So I think that one was very exciting for a different reason. And then Naiad, which is a beautiful film. It's the only one where it really does kind of influence the story itself. So it's a little bit more than a mention. And basically, one of the lead characters is swimming in the ocean. She's trying to make history by swimming from Cuba to Florida. Right. And she gets stung by a box jellyfish. And one of the people attending her support crew, makes the comment that, because of global warming, these jellyfishes, their territories are changing and they're migrating in different ways. And because the jellyfish sting does kind of influence the story, we would consider that a little bit more than a mention, even though it's definitely a minor plot. Right.
That's so cool. You don't even realize. Now I'm gonna start be more aware. Like when I watch movies and television, just be like, oh, there's a mention, or there's a placement, or and it's so interesting because normally when I think of people covering the environment, it's covering the environment in a documentary, right? And it's National Geographic, Animal Planet, Discovery is pretty much the three stations where you see documentaries. Netflix with some of their shows and stuff, and that's how you really think about it. But you don't realize some of the plots or subplots of TV shows and movies have this context with their fictional characters or recreation of characters, and you're just like, oh wow, this is such a big avenue to just normalize certain topics. And I think that's great. I just love the fact that we're seeing it. I'm definitely going to pay more attention to it because I'm sure a lot of us don't about a lot of things, a lot of different ways that we're being influenced. But I really like that. I just think that's such a great, a medium to really focus on. Everybody watches TV, everybody watches movies, or many people do, and we're all influenced by those stories.
The average American watches 3 hours of television and film a day. Not just
Yeah.
scripted, but oftentimes scripted.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
it's a huge, I mean, it's very much, our strategy is very connected to Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, the renowned climate scientist, who's one of our advisors and also a close friend of mine. She has a TED talk called "The Most Important Thing We Can Do About Climate Change is Talk About It."
Yes.
And that is because talking about it is a precondition to any form of action.
Right.
And we are in this situation in this country where it's, the numbers on American audiences, not to mention global audiences, which are even higher around, who is concerned about
Yeah.
climate change, are astronomical. Like, there's a new study that just came out, I think last week, where they looked at over 100,000 adults across 125 countries, very diverse countries and demographics, and found that 93% are worried, think climate is an imminent threat.
Mhm.
And the numbers in the United States are a little bit murkier because of how politicized climate has become,
Right.
but it's still the vast majority of audiences who are worried about climate.
Yeah.
People like my dad who are straight up climate deniers are less than 10% of our population. And so I think that even just hearing climate change mentioned in passing, even subconsciously, it just signals to the audience, like, this character that I have a relationship with is also thinking about this, is also worried about it, is also doing something about it. And that is massively psychologically valuable for validating the audience's own lived experience and own emotions and concerns, which of course is really important for mental health. So,
Yeah.
like, just like that sense of feeling seen and validated is one of the most powerful, kind of elements of TV and film. And
Right.
we know from a lot of psychological research that parasocial relationships can provide a very similar service that your real relationships do in encouraging you to talk about things in real life and encouraging you to do things in real life. So it's it's very, very critical, even those passing mentions,
Mhm.
but obviously more substantive climate stories that really help
Yeah.
us grapple with the mental health impacts, with the realities of being human in the age of climate change. All of those are really, really important for mental health and inspiring action and a range of other psychological values as
I
well.
bet. That's amazing. This has been a fantastic conversation. I love this. Good Energy is your organization. It's goodenergystories.com. What's coming up that you can tell us that you're working on, that you're excited about, that will come out maybe in the next year or so, or something that you're able to share?
Yeah, so we have the climate reality check coming out on Friday, March 1st,
Love it.
and the Oscars research. We also applied it to, or we didn't, Dr. Matthew Schneider Meyerson, who's the professor that we worked with at Colby College. He's one of the few professors who have studied climate narratives
Mhm.
in novels. He had it. This is the first time studying it in television and film, but he applied it to the 250 most popular films of the past decade, which is a bigger sample size. So we'll have that study coming out in April. And then we also have we partner with the Hollywood Climate Summit on quite a few
Yep.
things, which is a very cool convening of people within the industry and climate experts and activists that happens in June. So we always are involved in any of the climate storytelling related programming around that. And so we're going to do some really cool stuff in June for the Hollywood Climate Summit. And then we've been developing a workshop. So we have our Climate Lens workshop where we have adaptations for different genres like children's and comedy and mystery
Mhm.
thriller and feature films and creative executives. We're developing a new workshop in partnership with Hip Hop Caucus and Center for Cultural Power, who are two of our climate justice partners and two of our closest partners. And that's really elevating the intersection of racial justice and climate
Yep.
storytelling.
Love it.
So that will be coming out this summer. And then we're also looking at a whole suite of programming. Definitely want to do more on mental health and climate, just because that
Mhm.
is one of the things I'm most passionate about. Also, one of the most important roles that TV and film has and stories have in helping us learn what it means to be human in the age of climate change. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so many things going on. I don't know how you keep your head on straight with everything going. I just love it. I think it's great. Anna Jane, I would love to invite you back on to kind of give us updates every once in a while on what you've been working on and what we can look forward to, and just get more into, storytelling for today's climate. I think that's something that, again, like I mentioned, we don't talk about it enough. And the more we talk about it, maybe the better we feel about climate change, and the more we can get to action, like you mentioned, right? The precursor to action is discussing it. And I think this has been a great discussion. And Anna Jane, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on this podcast. It's been great having you on.
Oh, it's been an honor. I love this conversation, and it's been a pleasure talking to you about it. And yeah, check out our website, goodenergystories.com. We are a nonprofit. We always appreciate support for people who are able. And we have a lot of great resources on there, including the playbook for screenwriting in the age of climate change.
Love it. Love it. And we'll link to all of that into the show notes. And thank you again. Thank you, Anna Jane, for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was just a phenomenal interview for me. I don't know if you get my excitement. As I mentioned to Anna Jane, sometimes I don't know what to expect from certain guests, or the stories that they have to that they're bringing onto the show, or how they're going to talk about climate change or ocean conservation. And this is what I love about interviewing. I know I do a lot of solo episodes, but this is the one thing I love about interviewing, is when you get surprised at how people are going about conservation, how people are talking about climate change, and sort of inserting it, in this case, in the Hollywood productions. And I just think that's what a great way to get people to understand what's happening with the planet without telling them what's happening with the planet. How many times have I talked to people where, friends and family are like, hey, have you seen this documentary? Have you seen this Nat Geo documentary? Or I have a friend who's in this, have you ever seen it? No, they don't watch documentaries all the time. Some of them do, some of them don't. Most of them don't, right? But they will watch like The Rookie, or they will watch Extrapolation, or they will watch another, TV show, popular TV show. It'd be really interesting if they can get that involved in reality TV. I think that would be really cool. But even a show like Madam Secretary, very popular show, 8 million viewers per episode, and having an episode that was involved in climate change action, or just climate change as a topic, that's a big thing. That's a lot of people getting their eyes on it and talking about it and maybe taking action on it. Even the study that they conducted after at USC, talking to people who watched that show compared to people who didn't watch the show, whether they were willing to take action on climate. And they were, if they watched the show, and they less likely if they didn't watch the show. That's a big sentiment there. That's a huge revelation, being like, oh yeah, well, if I start watching it more, I'm going to start thinking about it more. I'm going to talk to people about it more. Right? They're going to talk to people. How many times have you gone to work, or to even talk to people at work on Teams or on Zoom or wherever, and then you start talking to people and you're like, oh yeah, like, did you see that show yesterday? They talked about sea level rise, or, it was all about this, or had a comedic kind of spin to it. It was really interesting. I've never heard of it talked that way. That's a cool thing. I think that's really interesting, and I think we need to do more of that. So, that's the episode today. I just thought it was fascinating, the work that people do, and how they sort of, I guess, present different types of ways of understanding climate and climate action and climate change. And I just think it's wonderful. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hit me up well, actually, first of all, before I say I want to hear your thoughts, I do want to hear your thoughts. But if you want to find out more from Good Energy, or even from Anna Jane Joyner, all the links will be put in the show notes. There's lots of links for you to take a look at. There's lots of ways of you to think about some of the ways we can talk about climate and how Hollywood is changing that narrative. So it's going to be really interesting. And if you want to tell me about the episode and what you thought, and if you have any questions, please reach out to me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. And if you want to get a hold of me by email, you can go to speakupforblue.com/contact. You can just fill out the form, get my email. It goes right to my email. And that's about it. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. And of course, if you want to find out more about what's going on in the ocean, I put out a newsletter 5 days a week all about stories that maybe you haven't heard or just been released about oceans. I talk about some of the stuff that I'm releasing on YouTube and I'm releasing on as the podcast comes out, so you don't miss any of the podcasts. So you can just go to speakupforblue.com/newsletter, sign up for that newsletter. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.